March 3, 1943. The Bismarck Sea is calm at dawn. Admiral Kimura believes his convoy is untouchable. Then shapes skim the waves. American B-25s. Guns roar. Steel burns. In just 15 minutes, an entire division vanishes. The sun was just climbing over the horizon when the Bismarck Sea revealed itself wide, calm, almost gentle. Thin clouds drifted across a pale sky, and the water reflected gold and blue like a mirror untouched by war. On the bridge of the destroyer, Shirayuki Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching his convoy cut clean white wakes through the sea. 8 destroyers, 8 transport ships, nearly 7,000 soldiers packed below deck. Everything was in perfect order. For more than a year, these waters had belonged to Japan. Convoys sailed under a shield of disciplined steel and experience. American bombers had come before high-flying B-17s that missed slow torpedo planes that died in fire. Nothing had ever broken the pattern. Doctrine worked. Training worked. Confidence followed. Below the decks, young soldiers from Osaka, Kyoto, Sapporo laughed softly, wrote letters home, and sipped tea as the ships rolled gently beneath them. This was just a crossing. The real fight waited on land. No alarms sounded. No sirens screamed. The sea felt safe. At 600 hours, Kimura raised his binoculars and studied the horizon. No enemy contacts. Good visibility. On schedule. What he could not see was that history was already moving toward him, low, fast, and deadly, about to tear apart everything he believed the sea would allow. Far to the south, while Kimura's convoy cut its steady path through the Bismarck Sea, the rules of naval warfare were already dying. In the choking heat of an Australian airfield beneath rattling tin roofs and clouds of red dust, American crews worked in silence. This wasn't a factory. It was a place where desperation replaced permission and where failure meant more men dying on distant beaches. At the center of it all stood Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. He was not a polished strategist or a desk-bound planner. He was a mechanic who flew a pilot who fixed his own machines, and a man who had seen too many bombers return empty while convoys sailed on untouched. High-altitude bombing didn't work. Torpedoes failed. And every missed ship meant another American grave in New Guinea. Gunn refused to accept that. So he broke the bomber. He rolled a B-25 Mitchell into a hangar and began tearing it apart by hand. The glass nose came off. The Norden bomb site, once sacred, was ripped out and tossed aside. Anything that didn't make the airplane deadlier was stripped away. Steel plates were welded into the nose. Then came the guns. 2.50 caliber, then 4, then 6. Finally, 8 long barrels jutted forward like the fangs of a machine built to kill at close range. The mechanics hesitated. There were no manuals, no orders, only Gunn's certainty. He recalculated the balance himself, shifted fuel, added counterweights. When the modified B-25 lifted off for its first test, the airframe trembled under the weight of steel and ammunition. At low altitude, Gunn squeezed the trigger. The sky didn't crack. It screamed. Shell casings poured from the fuselage like rain. The recoil hammered through the aircraft as if it were alive. When Gunn landed, he was smiling. "She doesn't bomb anymore," he said quietly. "She eats ships." Word spread fast. What had begun as a gamble in a dusty hangar was about to meet its first real targets. And far to the north, Admiral Kimura had no idea that the sea he trusted was about to rise up and betray him. What Gunn had created was only half the weapon. Guns could shred steel, but ships were still hard to kill. To finish them, the Americans needed a way to put bombs inside a moving hull. That answer came from another quiet officer who was tired of watching failure from 10,000 feet. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group had seen enough missed runs to know the truth. The Pacific was too wide, the weather too violent, Japanese captains too skilled. High-altitude bombing against ships wasn't courage, it was futility. So Ben looked down, not up. He watched waves break against reefs. He watched children skip stones across water. And one thought refused to let go. What if the bomb didn't fall? What if it skipped? At Port Moresby, he gathered his crews and explained the idea. Fly straight, fly level, fly so low the sea fills the windshield. Release the bomb at the last second and let it bounce across the surface once, maybe twice, then smash into the ship at the waterline. The room went silent. Everyone understood the risk. One burst of anti-aircraft fire at that height could tear a bomber apart. Release too early and the bomb skips away. Too late, and it ricochets back into the aircraft. They tested it anyway. Day after day, B-25s roared in over a wrecked cargo ship trapped on a reef. Propellers threw spray into the air. Bombs skipped wild, exploded short, or missed entirely. Aircraft were lost. Crews were shaken. But slowly, something clicked. Pilots learned the rhythm, the speed, the moment when sea and machine aligned. At the right height, the right angle, the bomb behaved like it wanted to kill ships. When one finally struck true, skipping once before slamming into the rusted hull and detonating inside the explosion, lifted the wreck out of the water. Watching from shore, commanders understood immediately. Guns' strafers would silence the guns. Ben's bombs would finish the job. Two reckless ideas had just fused into a single deadly doctrine. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a Japanese convoy sailed on unaware that the ocean itself had been turned into a weapon. By late February 1943, the pieces were finally in place. Guns, strafers, and Ben's skip bombers were no longer experiments. They were weapons. At airstrips carved from jungle and mud, crews trained until exhaustion blurred the horizon. They flew at mast height, 50 feet above the sea, so low their reflections raced beneath the fuselage. One mistake meant death. Precision was the only protection they had. The plan was brutally simple. The strafers would go in first, fast, low, and screaming, unleashing 8.50 caliber guns to rip open bridges, shred anti-aircraft crews, and blind captains at the helm. Seconds later, the bombers would follow, releasing their bombs so close the ships would have no time to react. The entire attack would be over in less than a minute. No warning, no recovery. Pilots practiced attacking from the sun, from the wind, from angles that radar couldn't see and gunners couldn't track. Mechanics painted shark mouths and names on aluminum noses, ruthless, dirty Dora Hell's Angel, not for bravado but to remind themselves these machines were hunters now. At night, men slept beside their aircraft, afraid to miss the call. Then the call came. Intelligence confirmed a Japanese convoy was moving toward Leh. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, thousands of troops. To Tokyo, it was routine. To the men at Port Moresby and Eagle Farm, it was the moment everything had been built for. Maps were spread across briefing tables. Grease pencils traced approach routes over the Bismarck Sea. Armorers loaded belts of ammunition and set delay fuses by hand. In the early hours of March 3rd, engines coughed to life in the darkness. Rain misted the runway. Harnesses were tightened. Someone whispered a prayer. One by one, the B-25s lifted into the night, navigation lights blinking as they disappeared over the jungle. Far to the north, Admiral Kimura's convoy sailed on beneath a rising sun, unaware that the aircraft hunting them were no longer bombers at all, but something new, fast and unforgiving, already racing low across the sea. At 10 a.m., the first warning came exactly as Admiral Kimura expected. Lookouts spotted silver flashes high above the horizon, American B-17Ss glinting in the sun. Kimura lowered his binoculars, calm, almost relieved. This was familiar. High-altitude bombers. Predictable. Harmless. He ordered the convoy to maintain course. Anti-aircraft crews swung their guns skyward, loaders feeding belts as black bursts of flak bloomed above the ships. The sea thundered with disciplined fire. Every eye looked up. No one looked down. 15 miles away, skimming the waves at nearly 300 miles an hour, a different kind of aircraft was coming in. 12 B-25's noses packed with guns' propellers whipping mist off the surface. They flew so low, their shadows raced across the water. Sunlight flashed on aluminum fuselages as they rose just enough to clear the swells, then dropped again, invisible to radar, unstoppable to human reflex. Major Ed Larner led the charge. Through his windshield, he could already see the Japanese convoy, perfect formation, white wakes slicing the sea. He watched the flak burst uselessly far above and smiled grimly. The trap had worked. A shout went up on the destroyer Shirayuki. Aircraft low guns tried to swing down crews, scrambling in panic. Too late. Larner pressed the trigger. The nose of his B-25 exploded in flame. 8.50 caliber machine guns roared as one, a solid wall of fire tearing forward at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Bridges shattered. Steel buckled. Men vanished in sparks and smoke. Anti-aircraft crews died before they could fire a single round. The sound wasn't gunfire anymore. It was a mechanical scream, a force of nature ripping across the deck. Bombs followed, skipping across the sea like stones slamming into hulls below the waterline before detonating deep inside. Ships lurched. Fire erupted. Smoke clawed into the sky. Behind Larner, more B-25s surged, in each picking a target, each delivering the same brutal lesson. In seconds, the convoy's perfect order collapsed into chaos. And Admiral Kimura, standing on a deck suddenly alive with fire, realized the truth too late. The sea he trusted had just turned against him. The attack did not slow. It multiplied. As Larner's B-25 clawed past, the burning Shirayuki, 11 more strafers poured in behind him, each one diving into the smoke and fire like a predator picking its kill. The convoy dissolved in seconds. Destroyers swerved violently, throwing up white walls of water as captains tried desperately to shield the transports. It only made them easier to hit. One after another, the B-25s came in low and fast. Guns walked lines of fire from bow to stern, cutting bridges apart, shredding rangefinders, ripping gunners from their mounts before they could even turn their weapons. Men ran. Men burned. Commands were never shouted. There was no one left alive to give them. Then the skip bombers followed. Bombs slapped the surface of the sea, bounced once, twice, and smashed into steel hulls at the waterline. The explosions came from inside the ships. Transports split open like torn cans. Engine rooms vanished in fire. Ammunition cooked off in violent bursts that lifted entire decks into the air. The destroyer Arashio tried to interpose itself between the attackers and the transports, turning bravely into the storm. 3 strafers hit it at once. 24 machine guns raked the bridge in a single converging stream. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was gone. Seconds later, the crippled ship slammed into a transport beside it, both vessels locking together in flames. The air above the convoy became a furnace. Tracer fire stitched the sky. Oil spread across the sea and ignited, turning blue water black and burning. Sailors jumped overboard only to surface screaming as the water itself caught fire around them. From above, American gunners watched in stunned silence. Ships were exploding everywhere. Smoke columns climbed thousands of feet into the sky. What had been a disciplined formation minutes earlier was now a spinning mass of wreckage fire and men fighting the impossible. The entire battle lasted less than 15 minutes. When the last B-25s pulled away, the guns finally falling silent, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. The convoy was gone, reduced to sinking hulls, floating debris, and a silence broken only by flames and distant cries. For Admiral Kimura, standing amid the destruction, one truth was now undeniable. The old rules of war were dead. When the last American aircraft vanished over the southern horizon, the Bismarck Sea fell into a silence more terrifying than the gunfire. Burning oil crackled across the surface. Wreckage drifted aimlessly. Where a perfectly ordered convoy had sailed minutes earlier, there was now only fire smoke and men in the water. Admiral Kimura stood amid the devastation, surrounded by heat and ash, struggling to comprehend what had happened. 15 minutes. That was all it had taken. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were either sinking or already gone. Thousands of soldiers, men who had been singing and writing letters at dawn, were now trapped below decks or thrashing in a sea that burned them alive. Survivors leapt from ships only to surface in flames. Others clung to floating debris, their uniforms soaked in oil, their voices hoarse from screaming. Some were dragged under by the suction of sinking hulls. Others vanished as secondary explosions ripped through ammunition holds. The sea itself seemed to rise and fall with each detonation, flipping lifeboats and bodies alike. Rescue attempts were desperate and chaotic. Damaged destroyers threw ropes and nets over their sides, pulling aboard the wounded with hands slick from blood and fuel. There were no bandages, no morphine. Sailors tore their own shirts into strips as the injured lay moaning on steel decks that were still hot from fire. Then the attackers returned. Low-flying strafers swept back across the wreckage, guns flashing again, not at ships, but at anything that still moved. Lifeboats shattered. Men in the water dove beneath the surface, choosing drowning over bullets and fire. For those who survived the first wave, hope died with the sound of the engines returning. By midday, sharks had begun to circle. Drawn by blood and vibration, they moved through oil-slicked water as survivors watched in helpless terror. Screams were cut short. One by one, voices disappeared. By nightfall, the convoy was gone. Of the nearly 7,000 soldiers who had left port, fewer than 1,200 would ever see land again. The rest were claimed by steel fire and sea. And as darkness settled over the Bismarck Sea, it became clear that this was not just a defeat, it was a warning. War had changed, and nothing that sailed in daylight would ever be safe again. When the first radio reports reached Rabaul, disbelief spread faster than panic. Officers read the message twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the meaning. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers lost, thousands dead. The convoy erased in a single daylight attack. Nothing like it had ever happened to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Not at night, not by submarines, not like this. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. In Tokyo, the report reached the highest levels of command. The language was blunt. No heroic phrasing. No tactical excuses. The truth was unavoidable. The sea lanes were no longer theirs. The doctrine that had protected Japan's empire for 2 years Speed formation, the umbrella of steel, had failed catastrophically. What shattered it was not a new battleship or a larger fleet, but aircraft flying so low they turned the ocean itself into a weapon. Emergency meetings were called. Maps were unrolled. Red circles spread across the South Pacific, marking the growing reach of Allied air power. Every major convoy route now lay within range of B-25 strafers. The conclusion came quickly and mercilessly. Moving supplies by day was suicide. The order went out across the fleet: no more daylight convoys. Troop transports were abandoned. Large formations were scrapped overnight. Instead, supplies would move in darkness: small ships, barges, submarines slipping along coastlines under moonless skies. It was a desperate improvisation, later known as the night run. It kept some units alive, but it could never replace what had been lost. An empire built on movement had been forced to crawl. The consequences rippled outward. Japanese garrisons in New Guinea and the Solomons began to starve. Ammunition ran short. Medicine disappeared. Malaria and hunger killed more men than enemy bullets. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea was not just the loss of ships, it was the death of logistics, the collapse of mobility, the moment momentum slipped away for good. For the Americans, the victory was quiet. No parades, no headlines at home. But among pilots and mechanics, the lesson was clear. Innovation had won. Improvisation had broken tradition. A handful of men in dusty hangars had changed the rules of naval warfare forever. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield of fleets and formations. It had become a hunting ground. And after the Bismarck Sea, the hunters ruled the daylight. In the months that followed, the shock of the Bismarck Sea never faded, it spread. Every Japanese sailor who stepped onto a transport afterward carried the memory of what had happened in daylight. Crews whispered about it below decks. Officers avoided speaking its name aloud. The sea had betrayed them, and everyone knew it could do so again without warning. Convoys that once sailed proudly beneath the sun now crept through darkness. Lights were blacked out. Radios stayed silent. Ships hugged coastlines like criminals preying clouds, and night would hide them from the sky. Even then, fear traveled faster than fuel. At the first rumor of aircraft engines, men froze. Some swore they could hear the guns before they saw the planes, a deep, rolling roar that meant death was already seconds away. Reports from survivors painted the same picture again and again. The attackers appeared without warning. Too low, too fast, too close. Gunfire like machinery tearing itself apart. Ships exploding from the inside. Officers admitted their men broke at the sight of low-flying bombers, courage drowned by memory. Sailors began calling the B-25 the eight-eyed demon, convinced it could see them even in darkness. Inside Japanese headquarters, analysts searched desperately for answers. Charts and doctrines were rewritten, but the conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. The enemy did not fight as expected. He adapted faster than tradition could respond. Discipline and bravery were no longer enough. The battlefield had become industrial, improvisational, unforgiving. For the Americans, the lesson hardened into doctrine. The B-25 strafer was no longer an experiment. It was a solution. Production increased. Tactics spread. Other squadrons learned to fly lower strike faster and vanish before defenses could react. The skies over the Pacific became a place of sudden violence, where control belonged not to fleets, but to whoever could think and move first. The balance of the war shifted quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of strategy maps. Japan still fought, still resisted. But something essential had been lost: the freedom to move, to supply, to breathe. From that point on, every mile of ocean was hostile. Every voyage was a gamble against innovation. The Bismarck Sea had not just destroyed a convoy, it had exposed a future where adaptation ruled and hesitation meant extinction. And in that future, the sound of engines low over the water became the last warning many would ever hear. Years later, long after the fires on the Bismarck Sea had gone cold, the meaning of that day became impossible to ignore. What happened in those 15 minutes did not stay buried with the wrecks, it rewrote the war. Japanese planners no longer asked how to win battles. They asked where the Americans were not. Large surface movements vanished. Fleets hid by day and moved like ghosts by night. An empire that once ruled the Pacific now survived by avoiding it. The Americans drew the opposite lesson. Speed mattered more than size. Ideas mattered more than tradition. The strafer became a symbol not of brute force, but of thinking faster than the enemy. Factories adopted field modifications. New variants carried even more forward firepower. Pilots stopped talking about bombing runs and started talking about hunts. Airfields, harbors, convoys, nothing was safe if it could be reached low and fast. The sound became legend. Japanese sailors said it first as a warning, then as a curse, the roar of guns that didn't chatter but screamed. To hear it meant you were already too late. To see the aircraft meant you were already dead. Courage didn't vanish, but it was drowned by memory. No drill could prepare men for an enemy that arrived inside their reaction time. Across the Pacific, attacks multiplied. New Guinea, New Britain, the Solomons. The pattern repeated with brutal efficiency, sudden appearance, blinding fire ships breaking apart from within. Logistics collapsed under the weight of constant interruption. Hunger and disease finished what bombs began. The war did not end in one place, it bled out everywhere. Historians would later argue over weapons and numbers, but the veterans knew the truth. The decisive blow wasn't steel or caliber. It was adaptation. A handful of men in a dusty hangar had proven that invention itself could be a weapon, and that once unleashed, it could not be put back. When the wrecks finally settled beneath coral and silt, the sea grew quiet again. Sunlight returned. Fish swam through rusted corridors where men once stood screaming. Above the surface, the Pacific looked unchanged. But beneath it lay the moment war became something colder, faster, and relentless. The Bismarck Sea was not just a battle. It was the moment the future arrived, low over the water, guns blazing, and impossible to stop. The legacy of the Bismarck Sea did not end when the smoke cleared. It traveled forward in time, carried by the idea that an aircraft could be more than a delivery system, it could become the weapon. What began as desperation in a sweltering hangar became doctrine, then inheritance. In the years that followed, American engineers and pilots kept asking the same dangerous question: what if we push it further? The answer echoed through later wars. Transport planes returned to the battlefield not as lifelines, but as executioners. Side-firing guns turned slow aircraft into floating fortresses. Fire no longer fell from above, and it swept sideways, precise and merciless, pinning enemies to the earth with mechanical certainty. The strafer's DNA lived on in every gunship that stalked the night. But among the men who had flown the first B-25s, there was no triumph in the memory. They remembered the sea on fire, the ships breaking apart, men leaping into water that burned them alive. Major Ed Larner would later stand in museums staring at polished aircraft hanging silent from ceilings and say nothing for a long time. The planes no longer screamed, but he still heard them. On the other side of the ocean, the lesson cut just as deep. Japanese naval cadets studied the battle not as a failure of courage but of imagination. Tradition had not saved them. Discipline had not saved them. The enemy had learned faster. And in modern war, speed of thought mattered more than honor or numbers. Today, the Bismarck Sea is calm again. Coral grows over twisted steel. Fish drift through passageways where soldiers once waited for orders that never came. Above, the waves roll gently, giving no sign of what lies beneath. But the wrecks are still there. So is the lesson. Innovation wins wars, but it always leaves ghosts. The strafer proved that necessity could turn mechanics into architects of history. It also proved something darker, that once invention is unleashed, it does not choose sides. It only accelerates destruction. And on March 3, 1943, in 15 minutes of fire and noise, the world crossed a line it would never step back from. Long after the war ended, when uniforms were folded away and the Pacific returned to blue silence, the truth of the Bismarck Sea refused to fade. Veterans from both sides spoke of it with the same uneasy pause, not as a victory, not as a defeat, but as a moment when war itself changed shape. The B-25 strafer had begun as an act of survival. No grand strategy, no blueprint. Just men working faster than death-welding steel and loading guns because waiting meant losing. Yet that urgency revealed something deeper. In modern war, invention was no longer support, it was the front line. Whoever adapted first would decide who lived long enough to adapt again. That lesson echoed forward. New aircraft were built around the same idea: durability over elegance, firepower over tradition. Planes designed not to intimidate but to endure, to stay low, to stay close, to finish the fight face to face. The philosophy born over the Bismarck Sea resurfaced again and again, each time deadlier, each time more refined. But progress carried a shadow. For every engineer who admired the brilliance, there were survivors who remembered the cost. The sound of guns that never paused. The sight of ships opening like torn flesh. The sea burning. Innovation had shortened wars, but it had also deepened the abyss they fell into. Speed left no room for mercy. Precision left no room for escape. Major Pappy Gunn never lived to see how far his idea traveled. When he died years later, a note was found among his papers. It read simply, "We built them fast because men were dying faster." There was no pride in it, only necessity. Today, the wrecks still rest beneath the Bismarck Sea, pierced with neat circular holes where bullets once passed. Coral softens the steel. Fish move through shadows of corridors and gun mounts. From above, the water looks peaceful. It always does. But beneath the surface lies the moment humanity learned something it could never forget, that creativity can be as lethal as any weapon, and once unleashed, it changes everything. The sea keeps its secrets. History remembers the sound. Standing on the shores of Papua New Guinea today, it's almost impossible to imagine what happened here. The Bismarck Sea looks endless and calm, its surface broken only by wind and light. No smoke, no fire, no sound of engines tearing the air apart. And yet beneath those gentle waves lies a frozen moment: steel hulls, split open corridors, punched through by bullets, and the remains of men who never saw land again. Divers who later found the wrecks were stunned by what time could not erase. The ships were not torn apart by massive explosions alone. Their hulls were drilled through with hundreds of clean circular holes, each one the unmistakable mark of a .50 caliber round. Even decades underwater, the evidence was undeniable. This was not destruction from above. It was execution at point-blank range. For the Americans, the battle became legend. Proof that imagination could overpower doctrine. that a handful of mechanics and pilots working in a dusty hangar with no permission but necessity could alter the course of a global war. The B-25 strafer was no longer just an aircraft. It was a philosophy: adapt fast, strike hard, leave nothing time to react. For Japan, the memory carried a different weight. The Bismarck Sea entered naval education as a warning written in blood. Tradition without adaptation was a liability. Courage without flexibility was not enough. The sea they once ruled had become a prison watched by an enemy that learned faster than they could think. War moved on. New weapons replaced old ones. New battlefields claimed new lives. But the lesson endured. Progress in war is never neutral. Every breakthrough shortens the distance between decision and death. Today, coral grows where fire once burned. Fish drift through gun mounts and passageways. Above it all, the sea gives nothing away. But history remembers. The Bismarck Sea was not just where ships were lost. It was where the future of warfare revealed itself, low, fast, merciless. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The men who built the strafer never set out to change history. They were not chasing glory or legacy. They were racing a clock measured in lives. Every convoy that slipped through meant another beach soaked in blood, another jungle filled with graves. So they worked faster than doctrine, faster than permission, faster than the war itself. And for a brief, violent moment, they won that race. But victory carried a weight that never lifted. Pilots who survived the Bismarck Sea rarely spoke about it in detail. When they did, their voices slowed. They remembered the way ships seemed to open up under fire, the way the sea burned, the way the noise followed them home long after the engines shut down. One veteran said the worst part wasn't the attack. It was the silence afterward, when the guns stopped and there was nothing left to shoot, only men in the water. For Japan, the lesson cut even deeper. The Imperial Navy did not lose because its sailors lacked courage. They lost because the world had changed faster than their beliefs. The Bismarck Sea proved that tradition, no matter how disciplined, could be outpaced by invention. From that day forward, Japanese strategy became defensive, cautious, haunted by the memory of aircraft that arrived inside the margin of human reaction. The strafer itself became both symbol and warning. In museums, it hangs clean and silent, its aluminum skin polished, its guns inert. Visitors admire its lines, its ingenuity. But those who know its story hear something else, the echo of 8 machine guns firing as one, the sound that meant there was no time left. War did not end with the Bismarck Sea. It only accelerated. Factories turned ideas into weapons. Weapons turned minutes into massacres. The distance between thought and destruction grew shorter with every innovation. What began in a dusty hangar became a template for modern war: adapt or disappear. Today, the ocean above the wrecks is calm. Sunlight ripples across the surface. The past feels far away. But beneath the waves, steel still lies where it fell, and history waits quietly unchanged. The battle did not just destroy ships. It revealed a truth the world has lived with ever since. In war, invention is unstoppable. And once unleashed, it never asks who must pay. On the morning of March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea kept its secret. It looked the same as it always had, calm blue, indifferent. By nightfall, it had become a graveyard. And beneath its surface, something far more lasting than wreckage had settled. The battle proved that war no longer belonged to the biggest fleet or the strongest armor. It belonged to whoever learned fastest, whoever dared to break their own rules first. In 15 minutes, tradition drowned, and a new age surfaced, one where machines were reshaped in the field. Tactics rewritten mid-war, and survival depended on imagination as much as courage. The B-25 strafer was never meant to be elegant. It was brutal, improvised, and unforgiving, just like the war that created it. 8 gun barrels pointing forward, no hesitation, no warning. It did not ask permission from doctrine. It erased it. For the men who sailed that morning, the sea became the enemy. For the men who flew low over the waves, it became a weapon. And for the world watching afterward, the message was unmistakable. Modern war would be decided not by tradition, but by adaptation. Today, the Bismarck Sea is quiet again. Coral grows over steel. Sunlight dances where fire once burned. But history has not moved on. It waits beneath the waves, reminding us that progress in war is never clean, and innovation always leaves a shadow. What happened here was not just a battle. It was the moment the future arrived, flying low, thinking fast, and impossible to stop.